March 19th, 2026, 3:47 a.m. local time. American F-15E Strike Eagles launched AGM-158 JASSM cruise missiles at Iran's Shahid Rajeh port complex in Bandar Abbas, not at military targets, not at missile batteries or radar installations, at the oil export terminals, the loading docks where supertankers fill with crude destined for Asia, the infrastructure that moves 2.1 million barrels of Iranian oil per day into global markets. 6 missiles, 6 direct hits. The satellite imagery confirmed it 90 minutes later. Terminal 3's loading arms twisted into scrap metal. Terminal 5's pumping station on fire. The central manifold system that distributes oil from inland pipelines to dockside tankers destroyed completely. And here's the number that should make every economist in the world stop breathing for a moment. The Strait of Hormuz moves 21 million barrels of oil per day. That's 40% of all seaborne traded petroleum on Earth. Saudi oil, Kuwaiti oil, Emirati oil, Qatari gas, Iraqi crude. All of it funnels through a waterway 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. And the United States just gave Iran the perfect justification to close it. Let me explain what these terminals actually are. Because when you hear oil export facility, you might picture a few pipes and some storage tanks. These are industrial complexes that cost $800 million to build and took 4 years to construct. Shahid Rajeh Port handles 2.1 million barrels per day of export capacity. The infrastructure includes subsea pipelines running 12 kilometers from shore to deepwater loading buoys, floating platforms where very large crude carriers, ships that hold 2 million barrels, can moor and fill their tanks over 18 to 24 hours, pumping stations that maintain pressure across the entire system, control facilities that monitor flow rates, quality, and safety parameters in real time. When you destroy a loading arm, you're not breaking a pipe. You're demolishing a precision-engineered hydraulic system that costs $15 million per unit and takes 14 months to replace. Iran had 6 loading arms at Terminal 3. The Americans destroyed 4 of them. Terminal 3 is now operating at 30% capacity. And that's assuming Iran chooses to operate it at all. Here's why that assumption matters. Iran's official response came 6 hours after the strike, not from the Foreign Ministry, from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy. The statement was 3 sentences long. American aggression against Iranian economic infrastructure constitutes an act of war. Iran reserves the right to defend its territorial waters and economic interests, using all available means. The Strait of Hormuz security is no longer guaranteed for hostile nations. That 3rd sentence is the one that matters. Not guaranteed for hostile nations. The Strait of Hormuz is not Iranian territorial water. Under international law, it's an international shipping lane. Iran controls the northern shore. Oman controls the southern shore. The navigable channel runs through both nations' territorial waters, but the right of transit passage is protected under UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Ships can pass through without Iranian permission as long as they're engaged in continuous and expeditious transit. That's the legal framework that has kept 21 million barrels per day flowing for decades. Iran just announced that framework no longer applies to hostile nations. And hostile nations, in Iranian definition, now includes any country participating in or supporting attacks on Iranian infrastructure. Let me walk you through what Iran can do if they decide the strait is closed. The IRGC Navy operates approximately 1,500 fast attack craft. Small boats, speedboats armed with machine guns, RPGs, and short-range anti-ship missiles. These are not blue water warships. They're literal assets designed specifically for confined waters like the Strait of Hormuz. In 2008, IRGC boats harassed U.S. Navy ships transiting the strait. The Americans didn't fire because the boats dispersed before rules of engagement were met. In 2016, IRGC boats detained U.S. sailors who strayed into Iranian waters. The sailors were released after 24 hours, but the message was clear. In these waters, Iran controls the tempo. A supertanker moving through the strait travels at 12 knots. That's 14 miles per hour. It cannot maneuver quickly. It cannot defend itself. If 20 IRGC speedboats surround a tanker and order it to stop, the tanker stops. Not because Iran can sink it, though they can, because the shipping company's insurance doesn't cover transit through active combat zones. And the moment Iran declares the strait a combat zone, every insurance underwriter in London pulls coverage. Here's the economic mechanism that matters. A tanker carrying 2 million barrels of Saudi crude is worth approximately $160 million in cargo. The ship itself is worth $120 million. Total exposure, $280 million. Insurance coverage for that transit costs the shipping company about $50,000 under normal conditions. If the strait becomes a conflict zone, that insurance cost goes to $2 million per transit. If it becomes an active war zone where vessels have been attacked, insurance becomes unavailable at any price. The ship doesn't sail. It doesn't matter if the U.S. Navy promises to escort tankers through the strait. Insurance companies don't accept military assurances as risk mitigation. They price risk based on actual incidents. One tanker boarded by IRGC forces means every insurer recalculates. 2 tankers stopped means coverage gets pulled. 3 tankers means the strait is effectively closed, even if it's physically open, because no commercial operator will risk a $280 million asset in an uninsured war zone. Iran doesn't need to sink ships. They just need to create enough uncertainty that insurance becomes unavailable. And the US just handed them the justification to do exactly that. American forces attacked Iranian economic infrastructure. Iran now claims the right to defend that infrastructure by controlling access to the waterway that hostile nations use to export their own oil. It's not piracy under Iranian framing. It's self-defense. And every tanker that gets stopped, boarded, or detained reinforces that narrative. Saudi Arabia exports 7 million barrels per day through the strait. The UAE exports 2.5 million barrels per day. Kuwait exports 2 million barrels per day. All of it moves through the same 21-mile choke point that Iran can threaten without firing a shot. Just the credible threat of closure is enough to spike oil prices. Brent crude was trading at $83 per barrel before the terminal strikes. It hit $127 per barrel 36 hours later. Not because supply was disrupted, because markets priced in the risk that supply could be disrupted, a 53% price increase based on fear alone. Here's what that means in real terms. The United States consumes 20 million barrels of oil per day. At $83 per barrel, that's $1.66 billion per day in oil costs. At $127 per barrel, that's $2.54 billion per day. The difference, $880 million per day, is the premium Americans are now paying because Iran might close the strait. That's $26 billion per month, $321 billion per year. The U.S. didn't just attack Iranian oil terminals. The U.S. created the conditions for a massive transfer of wealth from oil consumers to oil producers, and the primary beneficiary of higher oil prices is Russia. Russia exports 7.5 million barrels per day. At $83 per barrel, Russian oil revenue is $622 million per day. At $127 per barrel, Russian oil revenue is $952 million per day. The price spike the U.S. triggered by bombing Iranian terminals just gave Russia an additional $330 million per day in revenue. That's $9.9 billion per month that Russia can spend on weapons, military operations, and sanctions evasion. The United States attacked Iran and accidentally funded Russia's war effort. Let me explain why the terminals in Bandar Abbas were chosen as targets. Because this wasn't a random strike. This was a calculated attempt to degrade Iran's oil export capacity without triggering immediate escalation. The logic goes like this. Iran funds proxy groups, missile programs, and regional operations with oil revenue. Reduce oil revenue. Reduce Iran's capability to project power. Attack the infrastructure that generates that revenue. And you create long-term strategic degradation without direct confrontation. It's the same logic the U.S. applied to sanctions. Cut off money, cut off capability. The problem is that sanctions are economic tools that operate over months and years. Airstrikes are kinetic tools that operate in minutes. And Iran's response to kinetic attacks is not economic adjustment. It's military retaliation. The U.S. expected Iran to absorb the hit, maybe fire some missiles at U.S. bases in Iraq or Syria, and then return to the status quo with reduced revenue. What the U.S. didn't calculate is that Iran's most effective retaliation doesn't require firing a single missile. Close the strait, crater the global economy, watch American allies panic as their own oil exports stop. Saudi Arabia has spent $200 billion building an alternative export route, the East-West pipeline that runs from eastern oil fields to Red Sea ports. Capacity, 5 million barrels per day. That's 71% of current Saudi exports through the strait. The other 2 million barrels per day have no alternative route. If the strait closes, that 2 million barrels stays in the ground. The UAE has the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline running to Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman, bypassing the strait. Capacity, 1.5 million barrels per day. Current UAE exports through the strait, 2.5 million barrels per day. The math doesn't close. 1 million barrels per day of Emirati oil has no alternative export path. Kuwait has no pipeline bypass. Qatar has no alternative for LNG exports. Iraq's southern oil fields depend entirely on strait transit. Close the strait, and 40% of global oil trade stops, not reduces, stops. The U.S. knows this. Every war game run by CENTCOM on strait closure scenarios ends the same way. Global oil prices spike above $200 per barrel within 72 hours. Asian economies that depend on Gulf oil face immediate supply shortages. Strategic petroleum reserves get deployed but run out within 90 days. Recession follows within 6 months. The only way to reopen the strait in those scenarios is military action that takes weeks, costs billions, and results in casualties the American public won't tolerate. And Iran knows the U.S. knows this. That's why the IRGC statement was 3 sentences. They didn't threaten. They didn't bluster. They just stated the new reality. Hormuz security is no longer guaranteed. The burden is now on the United States to prove Iran won't follow through. And the U.S. cannot prove that without accepting the risk that Iran will. Here's the timeline that should terrify oil market analysts. The terminal strikes happened March 19th. Satellite imagery confirmed damage. March 19th. IRGC issued statement March 19th. Oil prices spiked March 20th. March 22nd, Lloyd's of London announced premium increases for all Strait transits. March 23rd, 2 tankers carrying Saudi crude delayed departure from Ras Tanura, citing security concerns. March 24th, IRGC boats conducted exercises in the Strait, forcing 6 commercial vessels to alter course. March 25th, a Kuwaiti flagged tanker reported being approached by IRGC craft in order to stop for inspection. The tanker complied. Inspection lasted 4 hours. No cargo was seized. The ship continued transit, but the precedent was set. Iran just boarded a commercial tanker in international waters and faced 0 consequences. That's not a military operation. That's a proof of concept. Iran demonstrated they can stop ships, board them, delay them, and create exactly the kind of incident that makes insurers recalculate risk. And they did it without firing a weapon. The Americans are now in a position where every response makes the situation worse. Escort tankers with warships? Iran boards a tanker anyway and dares the U.S. to fire on IRGC boats conducting what Iran calls defensive inspections. The U.S. fires, and Iran has the casus belli to close the strait completely. The U.S. doesn't fire, and the escorts are proven useless. Iran wins either way. Increase airstrikes against Iranian targets? Oil prices spike higher. Global economy suffers. American allies in the Gulf face the choice between supporting U.S. operations and protecting their own exports. They choose exports. The alliance fractures. Pull back and de-escalate? Iran claims victory. The message to every adversary becomes clear. Threaten global oil supply and America backs down. None of these options are good, and all of them were predictable before the first missile launched at Bandar Abbas. The strike on the terminals wasn't a strategic success. It was a strategic blunder that handed Iran leverage the U.S. cannot counter without accepting costs the U.S. will not pay. 40% of global oil now moves through a waterway that one adversary can threaten with speedboats and the credible threat of harassment. The U.S. spent $800 billion on defense last year. Iran is checkmating that spending with $50,000 speedboats and insurance calculations. That's not a failure of American military power. That's a failure to understand that economic choke points matter more than firepower when the adversary is willing to accept pain and the U.S. is not. The terminals are burning. The strait is threatened. And oil prices are up 53% because the United States tried to hurt Iran and gave Iran the perfect weapon to hurt everyone else. Share this because the mainstream coverage is showing you burning oil terminals and calling it a successful strike. They're not showing you the insurance premium increases. They're not showing you the IRGC boats conducting inspections. They're not showing you the timeline that leads from 6 missiles in Bandar Abbas to $200 oil and global recession. Both are true. Only one determines what happens next.